thank you very much, Mr. Shapps, for being here this morning, because I know it's an extremely busy and indeed significant weekend for you as Defence Secretary. Now, the Prime Minister said earlier in the week that he hoped that the police would be taking all steps to ensure that the remembrance services are safeguarded from any protests. Do you think the Met was successful in doing that yesterday, Mr. Shapps?
Morning. Well, I was here at the Cenotaph yesterday laying a wreath for the Western Front, and so I heard the thugs really turn up and at some points try to disrupt things and certainly turn violent. That said, they didn't make it to the Cenotaph itself. The 2 minutes silence went ahead, and of course up and down the country people will have been doing the same thing at their own war memorials, and that's what this weekend's really about. It's about remembering those who fought for our country, actually to give us the freedoms to be able to protest, but never to be able to protest by breaking the law. And I fully support the police in making arrests wherever those problems have come from, left or right.
I mean, we had problems from the EDL and some of the right-wing protesters. We also had problems once again with some of the pro-Palestinians. We had some extremely distressing banners that were carried showing Stars of David with swastikas in them. One banner showing Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman as coconuts. I think the Met Police is now investigating. In retrospect, should the pro-Palestinian march have been stopped?
Well, I always thought that actually this weekend of all weekends was not the time to have protests. It's about remembering those who fought for our country, the brave men and women who, within this department, we see their work all the time, but this is a moment for the country to celebrate their work as well. And I think it would have been preferable not to have had protests from any side. Having said that, we live in a free country. In fact, the irony, of course, being that without the bravery of people who've given of themselves for this country, the kind of freedoms to go out and protest wouldn't exist. So in the end, it was for individuals to decide what is unforgivable under any circumstances, whether it's extremists on either side, is breaking the law. And some of those banners were disgusting. Some of the chants are clearly anti-Semitic, designed to stir up hatred and support a terrorist prescribed organization in Hamas. So whichever side this is on, it's right that arrests are made, and I look forward to more arrests being made. I think particularly from the march, where it's clear that the police were either distracted by having to go after the extremists around the Cenotaph, or they weren't able to step in immediately, but with the photographic evidence we'll be able to at a later stage. I think it's really important that we see those prosecutions and consequences for people breaking those laws.
There's been a lot of continued criticism of your colleague Suella Braverman. The Home Secretary, Sadiq Khan, the London Mayor, has said that she's exercised ill judgment and naked ambition. We had Keir Starmer writing today in the Sunday Telegraph, where he's accused Suella Braverman of whipping up division that demeans her office. Is she right? Did she make things worse this weekend?
Well, I fear, unfortunately, actually, what we're hearing this weekend are people trying to play politics with the serious points which are being made, which is it would, of course, one, be better for people not to have protested. And secondly, it's very important that we see action taken, because I know this from my own experience. I was in transport. We had Insulate Britain gluing themselves to roads, and we couldn't stop that until I insisted that we took injunctions against those who were doing it, and eventually sent people to prison, and it was them actually having to serve time that actually effectively stopped that course of action, and that organisation disappeared. But so I think there's a legitimate concern. The Home Secretary is perfectly within her rights to call for strict action to be taken, for the full force of the law to be used. I'm not really keen on the idea that in retrospect, whether it's the leader of the opposition or the Labour London Mayor, that they then come in and try and politicise. This weekend of all weekends should not be about politics. It should be about the men and women who've given of themselves for this country. And that is what we should be talking about this weekend.
Although I think the criticism is that Suella Braverman's been the one playing politics as well, Mr. Shapps. Is this about her future leadership ambitions?
Look, I just, when you say blame politics, her job as Home Secretary is to make sure that, quite properly, that the powers exist and then the powers are then used within the operational independence of the police to make sure that marches and protests are properly policed, and where the laws have been broken, as they clearly have been in some cases, that those prosecutions take place. That is what a Home Secretary is there for. Now, I wouldn't have quite put it in her language. It's not the language I would have used, but the point still stands. And I don't think, whether it's Keir Starmer or the London Mayor coming in, I don't think their contributions particularly helpful.
Have you managed to speak to your colleague Michael Gove? We saw some quite disturbing scenes where the Levelling Up Secretary was basically targeted by a mob at Victoria Station, looked quite shaken up. Have you spoken to him, Mr. Shapps?
No, I haven't managed to speak to him. I understand he is okay. And it clearly shook him up. And we have seen, I'm afraid, some pretty appalling behaviour. You talked about the banners, but the chants as well, saying, from the river to the sea, things like this, which are clearly anti-Semitic tropes. Now, Michael Gove has spoken against that kind of anti-Semitism, and he seems to be being targeted because he spoke against hate crimes.
Yes.
So it's pretty despicable to see that kind of behaviour.
Mr. Shapps, I know you're Jewish. I know that your constituency has got many Jewish voters in it. How are your community feeling at the moment? How does it feel to be Defence Secretary and a Jew and witness what's been going on the streets of London over the last 4 weeks?
Yes, I'd say I'm sort of British and I'm Jewish, as you say. And I think that one of the great things about Britain is that we are, broadly speaking, a very tolerant country. In fact, I'd say probably one of the most tolerant democracies, if not the most, in the world. And I would hate to see that brilliant part of our society lost, which is why a day like today, when we're remembering the war dead, remembering those who serve our country in the military, but actually also in the civilian services, I think is really, really important. I'm very, very proud to be British, and I'm proud to be Jewish. I think that this country is a great place to live. It's only around the margins you see some of these very extreme activities. And the way to deal with that is to clamp down on it and make examples of people who do wantingly break the law and support, for example, prescribed terrorist organizations like Hamas. And if you do that, then I think we'll find we'll get back to the things which make us so brilliant and so tolerant as a nation.
Would you like to see groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, which have been some of the groups that have been leading some of the chants that have been so offensive to Jews? You mentioned From the River to the Sea. We've also seen Hizb ut-Tahrir be talking about jihad on the streets of London. Is it time for some of those groups to be banned, because they are banned in other European countries, Mr. Shapps?
Yeah, and I know that there's constantly a sort of review that takes place into all of these different organisations, and that's absolutely right to happen. I'm sure when the analysis of these marches and these protests have been carried out, there'll be more information to decide. So, look, I leave that to a very proper system that's in place to decide which organisations are banned and which are allowed. But, as I say, people going around and shouting jihad, I've seen this sort of idea that somehow it can be okay. I don't see how it can ever be okay, to be perfectly blunt. And I think that, we need to make sure that examples are made where people don't feel they can do that with impunity.
I mean, so you disagree then with the Met Police, because the Met Police response to the calls for jihad at a recent protest was to say, there are very many different meanings of jihad. What's your interpretation of the word jihad?
Yeah, I think that was entirely wrong. And there was clearly intimidating language, deliberately designed to stir up hate, and hate crime itself is a crime. So I don't agree with that particular interpretation, but I just want to put on record my thanks to the police, who do an incredibly difficult job trying to arbitrate between all of these different groups and factions. And I'd say a lot of it is it takes us away from the main point of this weekend. I'm here in the Ministry of Defence, just across the road from the Cenotaph, where I'll be returning in a moment, because we're all here to remember the bravery of people who've provided the ability for us to have free speech. But free speech does not include celebrating the murder of men, women and children, or intimidating other sections of society. And that is where we draw the line quite properly, and it's why we want to see action that's firm and proper taken to prevent and to create examples that you can't do that on the streets of this country and get away with it.
Final question, Mr. Shapps, because I know you have to leave now and go to the Cenotaph. Do you think we're doing enough in our schools to educate children about Poppy Day? There was some research this morning in the Sunday papers to suggest that children don't necessarily understand the meaning of remembrance. Do we need to be doing more in the national curriculum? Perhaps not just on that, but also affairs in the Middle East. We've seen quite a lot of ignorance displayed by younger people on the streets of London in recent weeks.
I think there's always a good argument for doing more and more of these things. I'm quite reassured. I went to a school on Friday in my own constituency in Welwyn Garden City, and it was a primary school, and they were learning all about poppies. In fact, they were designing and drawing poppies when I entered the classroom. So actually, one of the good things I think that has happened over the last several years now is that Poppy Day has become, or remembrance has become, I think, a notably bigger thing in our society. And it's quite right that it should be, and fantastic that people remember the sacrifice of people who've laid down their lives. Children should definitely learn about that as well. As I said, my own constituency, I was pleased to see they were just on Friday.
Mr. Shapps, thank you so much for taking time out of what I know is a very busy morning for you as Defence Secretary.